Welcome to a place where velvet curtains hide unspeakable truths, where the scent of perfume mingled with something darker lingered beneath the floorboards. In today's journey through forgotten pages of history, we're stepping into a world draped in royal opulence, but stained with secrets so grotesque they were buried literally beneath the queen's very feet. You've heard fairy tales of queens and castles, of grace, grandeur, and gowns that brushed across marble floors. But what if I told you that beneath one royal chamber, under the silken sheets and embroidered tapestries, there existed something far more sinister than any bedtime story ever dared to tell? A room built not for rest or beauty, but for screams. You're watching the kind of history no one dares to whisper, not in schools, not in palaces, not even in hushed gossip, because what we're about to uncover is not just disturbing, it's almost unbelievable. So dim the lights, settle in, and hold your breath. Because tonight, we descend beneath the bedchamber of a queen who smiled by candlelight while others bled in the dark below. She was known as Queen Violante di Aragon, a monarch rarely mentioned in the polished annals of court history, but whose reign cast a long shadow across 14th century southern Europe. Her name, derived from the Latin violentia, already hinted at the storm within. Officially, she ruled with intellect and poise, a queen consort turned regent after the sudden death of her husband, King Federico II of Sicily, but behind the delicate embroidery and holy devotion, Queen Violante harbored a fascination with pain and obsession with what lay beneath the skin, both metaphorically and grotesquely literal. The royal palace where she lived still stands today, though most of its secrets have been either erased or renovated over the centuries. Beneath what was once her private chambers lies a cold, arched stone room, a place originally dismissed by historians as a mere storage cellar. But scattered records, unearthed letters, and whispered folklore suggest something far darker once echoed through those stones. It was said that the floorboards of her bedroom creaked not from age, but from the faint movements below. That the sweet incense she burned so obsessively masked more than just the stale air of a medieval castle-lit masked rot, blood, and the screams of the damned. Violante had been orphaned at a young age during a coastal raid on the crown of Aragon. Accounts tell of her hiding for days beneath a collapsed monastery altar, surrounded by corpses and choking on the smell of incense and charred parchment. Perhaps it was then, in that trauma-baked silence, that something within her cracked or awakened. Years later, when she was married off to Federico II, many at court remarked on her distant stare, the way she lingered too long on stories of war crimes, how she watched wounded soldiers with a strange curiosity rather than pity. She did not recoil from violence. She studied it. When the king died suddenly, some say poisoned by Violante herself, she assumed regency with full authority. It was then the renovations began. Builders were brought in under the cover of night, stone was removed from beneath her private chambers and replaced with reinforced flooring and a discreet hatch, disguised cleverly beneath an ornate carpet woven with images of angels and saints. She told her ladies-in-waiting it was simply a wine cellar, yet no wine was ever seen delivered. And from that point on, no one outside her trusted circle was ever permitted inside her private rooms, ever. The hatch beneath her bed led to a spiral staircase of blackened iron, almost too narrow to fit a human frame. The air grew cold as one descended, the stone walls dripping with condensation even in summer. And at the bottom, a room entirely unlike the palace above, the walls were lined with rusted shackles. Tables stood with leather restraints and tools that defied explanation, some looking like farming implements, others like surgical devices twisted by a madman's hand. There was no furniture for comfort, no sign of servants ever entering to clean or maintain. It was not a room of luxury. It was a place of ritual. The queen was said to visit it often, alone. Her guards remained stationed at the bedroom doors, unaware of her movements beneath their feet. And those who disappeared from court, advisors who betrayed her, noble women who challenged her, servants who gossiped too freely were simply declared missing or fled. The kingdom was plagued by unrest and instability, which made these vanishings seem expected, but in truth, they were neither random nor unfortunate. They were deliberate, selected, Cataloged. One account survives in the personal letters of a court physician named Lorenzo Benedicto, whose writings were found in a hidden compartment of his study after his death. In a letter addressed to an unnamed colleague, he writes, "Her Majesty summoned me not for illness, but curiosity." She spoke of nerves and the sensation of pain. Asked how deep one must cut before a body ceased to scream. She smiled as she asked, as though pondering the mechanics of the lute. Later letters detail how Lorenzo was once called to treat a handmaid with injuries consistent with torture, though the queen insisted she had merely fallen downstairs. The physician, disturbed and fearing for his life, fled court in 1341 and died in exile 3 years later, poisoned, many believe, by one of the queen's agents. Still, the palace facade remained untarnished. From the outside, Queen Violante maintained appearances. She fed the poor, sponsored cathedrals, and even commissioned religious paintings, ironically, many depicting martyrdom and flayed saints. Her public persona was one of grace and solemn duty. But behind the mask of piety, her hunger for control of body, mind, and soul grew bolder. Eyewitnesses were few and far between, but one stands out, a palace servant girl named Lucretia, who in her old age dictated her memories to a local priest. Her testimony was later transcribed in a little-known ecclesiastical report buried in the Vatican archives. In it, she described sneaking into the queen's chambers to retrieve a dropped locket. Hearing a noise, she hid beneath a curtain and witnessed the floor hatch being opened. She saw Her Majesty descend into the dark. Hours passed. When the queen re-emerged, her white gown was stained at the hem, and in her gloved hands, Lucretia claimed, she held a single human tooth. Some historians dismiss this as fabrication, the ramblings of an old woman desperate for attention. But forensic evidence from a partial excavation beneath the palace in the late 1800s unearthed something that lends a shiver of credibility. Rusted restraints, small human bones, and fragments of iron tools, some designed to stretch, others to puncture, none for any peaceful purpose. What kind of queen built her own chamber of horrors? What compulsion drove her to descend night after night, alone, into a place of shadows and steel? It wasn't simple madness, it was controlled, calculated, and private. Violante never boasted, never confessed. She didn't need to. Her victims were not symbols, they were vessels for something only she understood. Some speculate she believed she was enacting divine punishment, purify the soul through suffering. Others suggest she craved control in a world that had once left her helpless, buried alive under bodies and prayers. Her reign ended as quietly as it began. She died in her sleep at age 42, her cause of death listed as fever, no investigation, no public grief. Her body was buried in a monastery chapel, sealed in marble, her face carved in eternal serenity. But the room beneath her bed was bricked up shortly after her death. No records survive about who ordered it sealed or why, yet some believe the walls remember that under layers of dust and time, that chamber still breathes. That its stone soaks in more than just moisture, that it has memory. And though tourists now walk the palace halls unaware, those who've stayed overnight report strange noises from beneath the floors. Chains rattling faintly, whispers rising through the cracks. And the scent, always the scent of lavender, mixed with something coppery and foul. Perhaps Queen Violante's secret died with her. Or perhaps, as some believe, it waits to be found. In the years that followed Queen Violante's death, the palace slowly returned to routine, at least on the surface. The court resumed its traditional ceremonies, new noble families entered the fold, and portraits of the queen were commissioned, in oils and gold leaf, all depicting her with a beatific gaze and delicate hands folded over a prayer book. Her official legacy was that of a regent who preserved stability in a volatile time, a woman of strength and mystery whose past was painted over with reverence. But beneath this carefully preserved image, a strange unease lingered in the palace. Walls, as if the building itself resisted forgetting what had once been hidden in its depths. The breaking up of the secret chamber had not been officially recorded, yet construction notes in an old architect's journal mention a subterranean room beneath the royal apartments that was no longer in use and deemed structurally unsuitable for entry. He noted signs of corrosion on the iron stairwell and moisture damage to stone consistent with bodily runoff. It was phrased clinically as though describing a broken cistern, but his final entry is more curious. Scribbled in the margin of the page, in barely legible Latin, he added, "The walls weep at night," whether metaphor or something more literal. No one knows. The next queen to reside in those rooms, Queen Margarita, made it known she disliked the space. She refused to sleep in the former royal bedchamber and ordered her quarters moved to the opposite wing of the palace. She claimed she was plagued by terrible dreams, visions of drowning, of women's screams echoing through stone, and of blood pooling in the corners of her room. Her confessor reportedly advised her to bless the space with holy water, and for a short time, a small chapel was constructed adjacent to the queen's chambers, but even this proved ineffective. One night, while returning late from evening prayers, a young novice claimed to see a woman dressed in white walking slowly through the corridor, leaving damp footprints behind her on the dry marble. When the figure turned to face her, the novice fainted instantly. After this event, the former queen's bedchamber was sealed permanently and repurposed as a storage archive, filled with scrolls and forgotten ledgers. Yet strange reports continued. One guard went missing while posted outside the room. Another was found unconscious, his nose broken, babbling about a woman beneath the floor. These occurrences were dismissed by palace officials as superstitious nonsense or the result of overwork, but those closest to the royal family began referring to the area as La Stanza del Silenzio, the Room of Silence. Historical analysis of Queen Violante's reign, especially in recent decades, has seen a quiet resurgence. Hidden among the pages of forgotten manuscripts and suppressed documents are occasional references to something darker at play during her rule. A particularly revealing account can be found in the diary of Brother Andrea del Vasto, a monk who served briefly as the palace chaplain before being transferred without warning to a remote monastery in Calabria. His diary, written in a meticulous and often anxious tone, described an audience with the queen in which she asked unsettling theological questions about the soul's capacity for pain, about whether suffering could purify a person more than prayer. She reportedly asked, "If Christ suffered to absolve mankind, must we not also inflict pain to purify those who sin?" The monk was disturbed, but dared not contradict the queen directly. He later wrote that her eyes held a peculiar light when speaking of agony, not of revulsion or sorrow, but something closer to wonder. He also noted a strange occurrence a few weeks after their meeting, the sudden disappearance of a nobleman named Lord Ferrante, a known political rival to Violante, who had accused her of embezzling church funds. Official records claim he died in a hunting accident, but Brother Andrea, in a private entry, wrote simply, "I heard screams from beneath." Then nothing more was said of Ferrante. Perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence came centuries later, during an unexpected restoration of the palace in the late 19th century. Workers attempting to stabilize the foundation of the western wing accidentally breached a sealed corridor. What they found caused the entire renovation to halt. Photographs from the time, kept in a private family collection for decades, show a narrow descending staircase coated in rust and mildew. At the base, partially collapsed, was a small room with heavily stained stone walls, a rusted iron frame resembling a bed, and fragments of leather straps still fixed to its corners, scattered. Nearby were bone fragments, human by all analysis, and a collection of ancient tools, some surgical, others unrecognizable. The most disturbing discovery was a single, preserved human finger, found in a sealed glass vial beneath a loose floor tile. It had been labeled in Latin, testis sanguinis, witness of blood. The findings were quickly silenced. Ownership of the palace had passed to the state, and local authorities feared that such grisly news would damage Sicily's tourist reputation. The chamber was resealed, the staircase covered, and all records archived under strict embargo. Yet whispers persisted. The workers who descended into the room all reported feelings of nausea, dizziness, and the overwhelming scent of iron. One of them, a stonemason named Giovanni Bellanti, later left a note in his personal diary before vanishing without a trace. His last words, "The queen still walks beneath. She never left. She is waiting." Over time, the story of Queen Violante morphed into local legend. Children dared each other to knock on the old walls of the archive room. Elderly townspeople warned visitors not to walk the west quarter after sunset. And every few decades, strange reports would re-emerge regarding hearing whispers in a language he couldn't place, an archivist finding ancient documents rearranged. Overnight, a single drop of blood appearing on the staircase where none had been before, all explainable, all deniable, but all deeply unsettling. It's worth considering what might have driven such a woman to such extremes. Was she, as many suggest, a sadist drawn to the infliction of pain as a means of control or pleasure? Or was there something more methodical, more obsessive about her rituals? Some historians believe she saw her chamber as a confessional, place where sins were purged not through words, but through suffering. Her victims weren't just political enemies or rebellious servants. Records suggest that some willingly entered her chamber under the belief that they were being cleansed of sin. It's a terrifying notion that she cultivated a theology of torment so persuasive that others accepted their own torture as divine will. The church never officially condemned her. No pope ever excommunicated her, and no formal inquisition ever occurred. In fact, a few letters from the Vatican archives reveal that some clergy even praised her strict moral discipline and commitment to penance. It raises uncomfortable questions about the intersection of religion and power, how spiritual language can be weaponized, how institutions sometimes turn a blind eye when cruelty wears the robes of sanctity, and still her chamber remains sealed, buried, but never erased. Unlike the grand ballrooms or throne halls, this room was not built for legacy, it was built for secrecy. And yet it may be the one part of her reign that refuses to be forgotten. Because even centuries later, when the palace is silent and the world outside has moved on, there are those who claim to hear something from beneath the old stone, a faint creak, a distant scream, the dragging of iron across stone, or the echo of footsteps, measured and slow, ascending narrow stairs toward a room now long abandoned. Some say it's just the shifting of ancient foundation stones. Others say it's memory itself, but a few believe it's her. There are places in this world where history is more than just dust on parchment, where it clings to the walls, seeps through the cracks, and waits. Places where time folds over itself, and the past doesn't simply echo, it breathes. The western quarter of the Sicilian royal palace, now refurbished and open to guided tour, is one such place. And those who walk it alone often pause, just for a moment, in front of a sealed wooden door tucked behind a velvet robe. It's unremarkable to most, just an old storage room, they're told. But some visitors linger a little longer. They don't know why, but something in the air turns cold near that door. Even in the height of summer, a few report a soft sound from within, almost like someone shifting their weight on ancient wooden boards. For decades, the chamber beneath Queen Violante's quarters was forgotten, at least officially. But behind the scenes, researchers, paranormal investigators, and a few brave historians have kept the whispers alive. One such man, Professor Emiliano Grimaldi, spent 30 years compiling the oral histories, private letters, restricted Vatican notes, and rare court documents related to the Queen. He was regarded by many as eccentric, even obsessive, but never dismissible. His research uncovered something no one expected: patterns. According to Grimaldi's notes, many of which were never published, there were at least 15 known disappearances during Queen Violante's reign that matched a chilling pattern. All were individuals who had either committed some perceived moral crime or had publicly embarrassed the Queen or the court. And all were last seen near the Queen's private quarters. It wasn't political enemies alone. One was a palace tailor, accused of theft. Another was a young noblewoman rumored to have had an affair with the prince. One servant was said to have accidentally spilled wine on the Queen's gown during Mass. All vanished. No bodies, no trials, no mourning. And then there were the confessions, in an obscure set of ecclesiastical records tucked away in a Milanese Monastery. Grimaldi found accounts of traveling priests who were granted audience with the queen in secret. These priests later documented their visits under pseudonyms, describing a strange arrangement in which they were to listen to the queen's reports of suffering inflicted and grant her absolution without ever seeing the victims. One priest wrote she described the cleansing in detail as though recounting the weather. Her eyes did not waver. She asked if penance through proxy could be as holy as penance through prayer. The priests never returned more than once. Grimaldi believed the queen considered herself an instrument of divine purification, not a sadist, but a judge. The chamber beneath her room wasn't simply a torture room. It was a sanctuary warped by madness, a confession booth turned inside out. And in her mind, she was not committing atrocities. She was saving souls through fire, through flesh, through fear. After Queen Violante's death, a curious shift happened within the palace's architectural plans. The rooms were slowly restructured, the hallway near her bedchamber was narrowed, access doors were reinforced and eventually closed off. For years, construction teams worked without full explanation. Some believed they were removing mold or rebuilding water-damaged foundations, but scattered mentions in royal maintenance logs reference something far stranger, unexplained rot that reappeared no matter how often the stones were replaced. One log describes a wall that bled at the corner, producing a thick rust-colored streak that no paint or sealant could cover. It was eventually plastered over and forgotten at least on paper by the early 1900s. Rumors of the Queen's chamber had evolved into local legend. Children told stories of the Lady Below, a ghost who punished liars and sinners by dragging them beneath the palace at night. Folk songs were sung in hushed tones about the iron staircase and the red room where time stopped. But while the public dismissed these as superstitions, a few underground writers and occult historians began to take serious interest. One such man was Wilhelm Drexler, a German-born scholar of medieval theology and ceremonial pain. In 1933, Drexler visited the Sicilian palace under the guise of a religious art historian. He reportedly bribed a custodian to let him into the sealed archive room for just 1 hour. When the custodian returned to retrieve him, Drexler was found sitting on the floor, muttering in Latin and holding his own bleeding hand. On the wall beside him, he had scratched a phrase into the plaster using a nail. Quae descendit, non. Redit, she who descends, does not return. Drexler never recovered. He was later institutionalized in Germany and died in 1940 during a bombing raid. His personal papers, recovered from a safe deposit box decades later, included sketches of torture instruments, theological diagrams, and one crude drawing of a spiral staircase descending into a mouth-like doorway. At the center of the drawing was a woman with a crown made of bone. Whether he truly found something or simply descended into madness is still debated. But Drexler's work sparked renewed interest among a small group of historians who began to explore the possibility that the Queen's chamber was more than a room. They speculated it was a manifestation of her psyche, a constructed space where physical suffering mirrored spiritual transformation. They weren't alone in this thinking. In 1984, a controversial psychological thesis was published in Milan under the title The Womb of the Crown, proposing that Queen Violante recreated the trauma of her childhood, the death, the blood, the isolation through architectural ritual. The chamber, the spiral descent, the steel tablet was all symbolic rebirth. Her victims were not just punished. They were reenactments of her own horror, over and over again. But what made her different from the sadists and murderers of history was her silence. Violante never wrote down her thoughts. She left no journals, no manifestos, no open decrees. Everything we know comes from what others observed, what they feared, what they whispered, what they tried desperately to forget, and still, evidence continues to emerge. In 2019, a routine inspection of the palace foundations revealed an air pocket behind one of the original stone support columns beneath the west wing. Thermal imaging showed a rectangular space with signs of metal reinforcement. Excavation was proposed, but halted indefinitely due to structural concerns and, some say, political pressure. The official report makes no mention of the size of the room, but one unnamed engineer claimed off record, "It's there." Just like the story said, a room, long, narrow, and something still hanging from the ceiling. Even now, some believe that within that sealed chamber lies more than relics, that the energy of what happened there, centuries of pain, fear, and ritual has embedded itself in the stones. Paranormal investigators who've attempted to conduct readings near the West Corridor report extreme fluctuations, recording devices that malfunction, and electromagnetic spikes with no known source. One medium who toured the palace in 2021 claimed to feel a presence watching from below and refused to finish the walk. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's something about the Queen's chamber that resists dismissal. It lingers in the psyche. It asks questions we don't want to answer about power, control, and the terrifying capacity of belief. Because what if she wasn't just a sadistic queen hidden by history? What if she truly believed she was saving the people she tortured? And what if some of them believed it too? In silence, beneath her chambers, they screamed. And through that screaming, she found purpose. There's something deeply disturbing in that. Something we can't easily categorize as evil or insane. It's something else, something colder, something far more enduring, because even now, hundreds of years later, that sealed room still exists. And those who know the truth, who've read the hidden letters, who've seen the forbidden photos, understand what it means. The queen is gone, but her room remains. And perhaps in some impossible way, so does she. The truth of Queen Violante's hidden chamber, sealed and suffocating beneath centuries of stone and silence, is not only a historical curiosity, it is a reminder. A reminder that evil does not always announce itself with horns and flame. Sometimes it wears silk gowns, quotes scripture, and smiles from a painted portrait above a marble fireplace. Sometimes it kneels to pray after a night of agony delivered with surgical precision. Sometimes it rules. As the years slipped into centuries, Queen Violante's name faded from common memory. While other rulers were remembered for conquest or diplomacy, she was remembered in fragments, rumors, disappearances, strange architectural anomalies no one wanted to explain. The royal records gradually reshaped her story into something more palatable: a pious woman, a grieving widow, a stabilizing presence in a turbulent time. But the stones of her palace remember what the ink dared not record. A former palace librarian named Anselmo Tarquini once confessed, in a private letter never meant for publication, that he found himself inexplicably drawn to the disused West Wing even as a young apprentice. Something about the silence there, he wrote, was not empty but full. He claimed to have dreams of descending narrow stairs into darkness, though he'd never seen any in the palace. He would awaken drenched in sweat, his ears ringing with sounds he could never describe, part scream, part chant, part breathless laughter. When he finally accessed forbidden documents stored deep in the Vatican's private archives papers, marked non divulgare, he recognized details from his dreams. The layout of the stairs, the shape of the iron table, the scent of burning lavender. He died 6 months later, struck by a sudden illness no doctor could explain. The only thing found on his desk was a final note, just 3 words in Latin, ipsa magna infra. She remains below. To this day, those 3 words continue to haunt researchers, particularly those who have devoted their careers to unearthing forbidden knowledge. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how much of the palace is renovated, rewired, or reopened to the public, there is one truth no historian can fully explain: Queen Violante's torture chamber was never truly dismantled. It was hidden, sealed, swallowed by the palace as if to contain a wound that could not be treated, only covered. Some say the room itself is cursed. Not in the sense of fairy tales or folklore, but cursed in the psychological sense, a place where suffering became ritual, where pain was reordered into meaning. A place designed by someone who could not escape her own memories, and instead chose to recreate them in flesh and stone. That kind of energy doesn't die, it settles. It waits, and sometimes it calls. In 2022, a small team of urban explorers managed to sneak into the lower substructures of the palace during a construction delay. Their footage, most of it unstable, flickering, barely watchable, surfaced briefly on encrypted forums before vanishing. But a few who saw it remember one thing clearly: a brief, silent clip of a narrow staircase descending into darkness, and a faint sound at the edge of hearing a woman's voice, humming what sounded like a lullaby. It's possible it was a hoax, an elaborate fabrication, but those familiar with Sicilian nursery rhymes were quick to identify the tune, a 14th century cradle song, one that Queen Violante was said to have sung to her lost infant daughter, who died in infancy and was buried in the cathedral just 2 weeks before the first known cleansing took place. Her grief was documented, but what no one could predict was how that grief would harden into ritual, into structure, into stone. And what of the victims? The dozens, maybe more, who entered that hidden place and were never seen again. Their stories were never told, their names scrubbed from the record, their fates sealed in brick and blood. But in the fragments that remain, the torn letters, the priest's confessions, the screams remembered in dreams, they are not completely lost. They linger too, not just as victims, but as warnings, because Queen Violante's greatest weapon was not the blade, nor the rack, nor the twisted theology she whispered through locked doors. It was the illusion of virtue, the mask she wore so flawlessly that, even centuries later, people still debate whether she was evil or misunderstood. But evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it curtsies, and so the room remains. Beneath layers of bureaucracy, beneath government protection orders, beneath public disinterest and historical erasure, it waits. Not because it is forgotten, but because it is remembered too well by those who know, and what they know is this: the chamber cannot be destroyed. Because it was never just a physical space. It was an ideology, a belief system in stone and silence, a belief that pain purifies, that silence sanctifies, that power justifies, and beliefs like that never really die. They lie dormant, waiting for a new face. A new hand to lift the latch, a new believer to descend the stairs, because somewhere, beneath the western corridor of that ancient palace in Sicily, behind the wall that no one touches, downstairs no one admits exist, in a room no longer mapped or lit or spoken of, he waits, not in body, not in ghost, but in memory and shadow, and the parts of human nature we prefer not to confront, the ones that find reason in cruelty. The ones that can convince themselves that suffering is sacred, that pain is justified, that silence is holy. She waits in every unchecked belief, in every excuse wrapped in righteousness, in every act done in the name of something greater. And maybe, just maybe, she waits for us. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that queens die, kingdoms fall, and palaces crumble. But what's built beneath what's buried in? The dark always has a way of being found again, and when it is to help the one who opens the door.